Hi, welcome to our podcast. I am Kelsey.
And I'm Allison, and today we're going to be discussing some welfare programs that exist in the United States. Specifically, we're looking at the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or the AFDC, and the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF. Before we kind of go into it, we're just kind of run really quickly on what each of these programs are. So the AFDC was established in 1935 as a grant program that enables states to provide cash welfare payments for needy children who have been deprived of parental support or care because their mother or father was absent from the home or incapacitated or deceased. All 50 states and territories have this throughout the United States, and these states defined the need and they set their benefit levels established within the federal limitations based on the income and resource limits, and the states also administer this program. During the 1990s, the federal government increasingly uses authority to waive portions of the federal requirements under the AFDC, which allowed states to test these changes as they expanded and earned income disregards, increased their work requirements, and they had stronger sanctions for failure to comply with them. And they also placed time limits on these benefits, and they expanded access to transitional benefits such as childcare and medical assistance.
So you might be asking a question, what are the requirements associated with these programs? And the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996 replaced AFDC with a cash welfare program as TANF, as we discussed earlier. TANF included a limit of 5 years, 60 months, on the amount of time a family with an adult can receive assistance funded from federal funds, increasing work participation rate requirements, which states must meet, and a broad state flexibility on program design. TANF funds must be used in any way that supports one of the following: to provide assistance to needy families so that children can be cared for at home, independence of needy persons on government benefits by promoting job preparation, work, and marriage, prevent and reduce incidents of out-of-wedlock pregnancies, and encourage the formation and maintenance of two-parent families.
So some of the restrictions that we're going to be talking about are as Kelsey said, the time limits, about the 5 years or the 60 months on the welfare programs. But there's also restrictions based on drug and felony conviction status. There's pretty strict work requirements. There's also restrictions on immigrants. And there's family caps.
So our podcast today will be loosely in a debate format where we're both going to argue different sides of these restrictions. Basically, Allie will be arguing why these restrictions are good and why they are working and why they need to be part of these welfare programs, and I will be talking about some of the failures, oversights, and basically why these restrictions and welfare programs are unnecessary or unjust. So, Allie?
All right, so let's start with the restriction on time limits. I think that's a highly debated topic when it comes to welfare programs. So let's just get right into it. So again, the time limits on the welfare is 5 years or 60 months. And the whole purpose of this is to try and encourage people to get off welfare programs in a relatively quick fashion. We're trying to encourage independence and we're trying to encourage financial stability, right? The TANF is temporary for a reason. That's just a quick, I don't want to say quick, I mean 5 years is not necessarily quick, but it's meant to be a temporary assistance to encourage and kind of help you get back on your feet and then go back into your actual life and having that independence, right? And there's a lot of arguments and some research that shows that it encourages welfare recipients to find jobs and leave welfare relatively quickly and sometimes even before their time restrictions are up. Specifically, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, they have a bunch of different articles. There is some evidence that suggests that time limits cause welfare recipients to find these jobs or have good job preparation and leave their welfare programs quickly, sometimes before reaching their limit. And these time limits might be responsible for some welfare caseload decline. And the strongest effects have been seen for families with young children.
So, in response, I'd like to point out some arguments of mine where time limits lead to actually unproductive job matches. So, microeconomic researcher Jeffrey Groger analyzed the Welfare Reform Act of 2001 and came to several conclusions on how the time limit reform would affect the job market and families. He stated that to the extent that time limits hasten job search and lead to poor job matches, it may not be surprising that the effects of time limits on the labor supply are less significant than the effects on employment. The results may be jobs that are both less durable and less well paid. So basically, we're extending this job search. We're forcing people into jobs that are just not a good match for them and aren't long term and aren't well paid, and it's better to just have a job than not have one on these programs, and we're not really incentivizing people to find careers. And furthermore, I know that you mentioned the idea that the strongest effects of these time limits are seen on younger families, and that's true, but not in a good case. The effectiveness of time limits in low-income families relies entirely on the child's age in a lot of cases. Groger stated in his research that families with younger children are less likely to use welfare than families with older children because the set time for welfare may very likely run out before the time the child turns 18 years old, thus leaving them unaided. So a lot of these families choose to hold off applying for welfare, hold off on getting aid, hold off on getting the help that they need, and just waiting till their child is older so they can see these benefits through the time that they're 18.
I completely hear you there about the time constraints and how families with older children often don't apply because the welfare would run out before they age out. But I think it's also important to notice that when people leave the TANF due to time constraints, they're also not completely in help. So it's not like their time limit runs out and you send them off and give them absolutely no support, right? So these people who leave who are not on their own when they leave because of the time constraint, they're still often receiving their food stamps, they're still receiving Medicaid, they're still going and attending these other programs following their exit. So I think it is important to also understand that, yes, these time constraints can impact families with older children. However, when they have these older children, it's important to note that they still are receiving other forms of welfare. So they are still receiving benefits.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and my research showed that many time limit leavers still receive food stamps, Medicaid, and other assistances. But then that kind of begs the question on what is the point, because if people are still receiving aid after these time limits expire, then what's the point of having time limits in the first place if they're kind of going unenforced? And a study conducted by the U.S. Department of Human and Health Services kind of surveyed state welfare administrations in 5 states and specifically looked at their time limit policies and the experiences of those who were on these time limit policies. And they honestly found too much variability between results, as post-exit employment rates of the time limit leavers kind of varied widely across the states, ranging from less than 50% to more than 80%. So it really begs the question on just how effective is time limit policies, how effective is it in actually giving people help, setting them up for success, and then meanwhile also achieving its goal of cutting down the amount of people on welfare and receiving aid.
Yeah, I totally hear you. Those are really good points. I'm kind of going to transition now into one of the other restrictions that are on the welfare policy. Specifically, I want to look at the family caps, which, if you don't know what that is, basically a family cap, it places a limit on the number of children you can have when you're on the welfare. So if you have too many kids, you can actually get cut off. And the whole purpose of this is to encourage financial stability for these families, right? You want to encourage families and parents to be financially stable before raising a child that they may be unable to care for, right? Children are very expensive to raise. There's a lot of needs that come with having children, and we want families to have stable home environment, stable financial status, because that is extremely important for child well-being. Being raised in poverty, it is a stressor. It can impact the well-being of the child. It can impact their educational experience. So the whole point is to make sure parents are planning ahead and making sure they have the financial resources to raise the child.
Yeah, but I think that in your argument, you're kind of lacking a lot of the historical context of it, where the family cap idea comes out of a lot of the stigma that welfare recipients, specifically welfare mothers, are purposely having more children to receive more money on welfare, which Kathy Eden, an American sociologist, she actually performed a study in Camden, New Jersey, examining low-income families with children out of wedlock. She found that the stigma is that poor mothers have children to receive more money from welfare, but that her research showed that that's actually not very reflective. On average, you only receive $75 more for having more children while on welfare, which is insignificant enough to raise a child. Anyone can kind of tell you that. And furthermore, families on welfare on average only have about 2.1 to 2.3 children. Instead, research shows that children bring a new sense of calling and joy to impoverished families and communities, that both mothers and fathers have this increased sense of purpose in having children while impoverished. And we often hear the saying that it takes a village to raise a child. And that can't be more true for poverty. And there definitely is an argument that could be made that, children growing up in poverty, that it's a traumatic experience. But the community cohesion brought out by having a child in these impoverished communities, shows that it kind of helps in a few ways. It, brings a sense of belonging as a place, and it pushes people upward in social mobility by creating this cohesion.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kels. One of the things I kind of want to dive in a little bit deeper, and some of the things you said about taking a village to raise a child. I totally hear you. It absolutely takes lots of people to raise children, right? But part of it is also preventing babies born out of wedlock, right? Encouraging stability among families, keeping families together. For example, President Reagan, in one of his radio addresses to the nation, this is back in 1986, so let's keep that in mind as well. But I think it still applies. He was talking about there was a crisis in family breakdowns, especially among welfare recipients, both black and white families. He says that babies born out of wedlock, children born out of wedlock, it can be problematic, and it can lead to family breakdowns, which is why part of the reason that this family cap exists, right, is to keep these families together. And I know a common argument against what I'm saying, and I'm just going to acknowledge it now, is that people believe that having this family cap, it takes away your individual right to have children, right? There's a very large ethical debate about this. From my viewpoint, I think I hear you, I understand it's absolutely right to raise a child, but the problem is that there has to be a cap somewhere. There has to be a cutoff. You can't have an infinite amount of welfare. Recipients can't just have child after child after child and just keep getting more and more welfare, because that's also not fair to those children.
I wanted to address something that you said quickly about the breakdown of a family, like family breakdowns. And frankly, I don't think anything has been more effective in breaking down families than this family cap, and kind of invading how people choose to have families in this country, why people choose to have families, and how they choose to honestly handle their own bodies too. In a 2004 study conducted by the National Bureau of Economic Research, they found that, they first studied the relationship between the family cap, birth rates, and abortion rates within 24 states. They used age, marital status, and completed schooling to identify women who they placed in this kind of high-risk category for public assistance. And the number of previous live births they used to identify the most directly affected women with the family cap. And they found in family cap states, birth rates fell 8%, while abortion rates rose 12% more among high-risk women. And this trend is even clearer when you look at the African American population that they studied as well, where in that population birth rates fell 21% and abortions rose 32%, which kind of plays into this idea of the family cap coming from this racist origin, this racist idea that Black women are having the most children, they're on welfare the most, which just simply isn't true. Overall, I think that welfare family caps have basically failed to achieve the proponents' and primary objectives of lowering the number of children born into families receiving public assistance. Instead, the policies have kind of extended poverty and have, basically hurt the family in many ways. It's hurt, food, housing. It's hurt health. It's hurt the social outcomes, and they've kind of all been perpetuated by, and they kind of stem from these false stereotypes and racist myths about welfare beneficiaries.
Okay, now we're going to transition into a different restriction on the welfare. We're looking at the work status requirements that are placed. Specifically, I want to talk about how this is a kind of a good thing because it encourages people to get jobs, right? So, part of the work requirement is it forces recipients of welfare to either have a job or be actively searching to seek a job or get job training, right? And the whole point of this is to prevent welfare recipients from, for lack of a better term, mooching off the system, right? We don't want people on this system and they're getting money, but they're not working for it, right? So we want to have people either have a job, looking for a job, or receiving some form of job training. And some research has shown, according to the Congressional Budget Office in 2022, it said that actually can boost employment for single parents. So there is evidence to show that this is effective. It is effective at helping people get jobs. And job training can also help people search for long-term employment, getting careers, which will eventually transition them to getting off the welfare system, which is the whole point of the TANF, it's a temporary assistance, and the whole point is to instill that independence in people and help them find those long-term careers, so in the end of the day, in the long-term future, they're not dependent on government assistance in order to make ends meet to pay their bills and to care for their children.
So I would just like to point out that employment increases did happen after, kind of the first initial implementation of these restrictions on welfare. But among these recipients subject to work requirements, the increases became sort of like modest and kind of dwindled over time. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities published an article that kind of compiled some evidence and points to the ineffectiveness of work requirements. They pointed out that the large majority of individuals subject to work requirements have actually remained poor, and some have even become poorer. Stable employment among recipients subject to work requirements have actually proved to be an exception and not the widespread norm as the work requirement implementation kind of was hoping for, and that was like the goal. Instead, most recipients with significant barriers to employment have actually never found work after participating in the work programs provided through welfare. And they were kind of deemed unsuccessful. Physical and mental conditions have proven to limit individuals' abilities to work, or the kind of work that they can do that will be able to provide them stable enough work, a stable enough income to actually receive welfare in the first place.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I hear you that some people remain poor and that some of these work programs aren't beneficial. But here's my counter to that is this fair? And what I mean by that is it fair to somebody who, let's say you have two people, you have person A and person B. Person A is out there, both people are on welfare, but person A is out there in the world trying to get a job, or does have a job and is working, trying to make ends meet, and there's an effort there. Person B is at home not doing that, right? They're not participating in work programs. They don't have a job. They're just staying at home. So my question to you then is, do you believe that this is fair, that these two people, one's trying to get a job and one's not? Is it fair that they are both receiving the same government assistance?
Yeah, I definitely hear you, and I think that is a great question to bring up, but I think I want to just return back to my source about the Center of Budget and Policy Priorities and their studies. They found that voluntary employment programs actually have shown that they can significantly increase employment without the negative impacts of ending the basic assistance for individuals who can't meet these mandatory work requirements. And I think a great example of this is you got to think of the single mothers who are on welfare. A lot of the time, they don't have the luxury of working and being able to pay for childcare at the same time. So they either have a choice. They can either go out and join the workforce and leave their kids neglected at home, or they can, choose to take care of their children but not receive these welfare benefits. But I think by having more voluntary employment programs gives these mothers to become working mothers on their own time and with their own kind of responsibility, where they can kind of decide how much they want to work, when they want to work, and how they can kind of balance their role as a mother, as a single mother furthermore, while also providing for their families with, of course, welfare assistance.
So we're kind of approaching the end of the podcast. So to wrap this up, we're going to do a quick summary of all the arguments that were brought up, followed by a brief reflection on our personal stance on this. So just to kind of quickly summarize the pros of the restrictions on welfare. I kind of talked about how the time limits encourage people to get off welfare in a timely fashion, about encouraging them, this is a temporary program, trying to get them to move away from the welfare programs. I also talked about the family caps and how they encourage parents to be financially stable before having children to prevent kids from being raised in poverty, as that is a stressor and can impact the well-being of the child. And I also talked about how the work requirements require people to be either working or actively searching for a job, which will help their transition off of welfare to a future career.
And then some of the summaries for the cons that I stated is that our current welfare system in this country is not only ineffective, but oftentimes immoral, as it infringes on the rights of individuals and families by treating them as basically second-class citizens. Time limits lead to unproductive job matches and injustices between families with varying child ages, and do not accomplish their goals in getting individuals off of welfare quickly and smoothly. Furthermore, family caps perpetuate inaccurate stigmas surrounding poor families, takes the right to have families out of the hands of citizens, and fail to lower and reflect the number of kids that a family has. Lastly, work requirements fail to increase income and increase stable jobs, as well as account for and support the diversity of the U.S. workforce.
So my personal opinion on this stance is, even though I was arguing for the pros, I was basically playing devil's advocate throughout this debate, because I can't deny that there is an overwhelming amount of research out there that Kelsey very clearly highlighted in this debate that shows how these requirements are ineffective or not ethical. It's not ethical to limit families to how many children that they should be allowed to raise. I think there should be, again, a limit on it, but at the same time, it's not fair to tell families that they can't have children. It's not fair to restrict them to certain time frames. It's not fair to make them try and find jobs when a lot of these times they're working temporary jobs, they're working multiple jobs, and they're still remaining and living in poverty. So I do agree with Kelsey and all of her points that during this debate, that these restrictions at the end of the day aren't really beneficial and don't really do what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And in my reflection, I actually very much agree with my side that I had stated. I believe that it's kind of imperative that the U.S. works to reform welfare as it is today to be more expansive and understanding of the diversity of Americans. I really do think that when welfare reform was initially happening, and when we first saw the initial effects of it, I think that it really did reflect the values of the times, a whole family, a stable family, people working, pushing forward of the economy. But as our society has grown and adjusted, those goals have either become kind of unreachable, unattainable, but also kind of outdated, and that our current welfare system needs to be not only reflective of America today, but working for America today, and especially taking special care into poor families, and of course families of color, and families that are minorities, and especially taking care of them and looking at what they need. And I feel like welfare often over time has become like the government deciding what a family needs, and not so much a family speaking for themselves and advocating for themselves and being able to say, no, this is what we need, instead of the government kind of deciding for them. All right. And that is a wrap.